Okay. I'll go
Today's,
through one.
I
Oh,
can,
go ahead, please.
I'd like to start and introduce you, Mike.
Okay.
Today's topic is GMO Controversies by Mike Jaqua. He is a highly experienced writer who has created educational materials for many types of audiences. So Mike, if you can start out and give us a little bit of background on your education and experience.
Okay, so I got a master's degree in immunology. I've done research in a number of areas, about a 20-year research career. And then after that, I got into medical writing, making educational materials for all sorts of different levels. And when I talk about GMOs, I haven't made those per se, but I have jockeyed a few genes around, so familiar with that. And as we go through, if you have any questions, please pipe up or use the hand raise thing down there. And Cheryl, if you see a hand raised or something, just interrupt me. All right. So everybody can see this first slide, yes? Yes, okay.
Yes.
Okay. So talk about GMO, and mostly I'm presenting, what they are and how they're made and those sort of details. There's always controversies that come in with it. This first slide is just a little example of some of the things that are genetically modified. Just corn, we all know about that. Fungi like mushrooms, yes. Bacteria, caterpillars that make more silk, and fish that grow bigger, mice that we use for genetic research, and old Dolly the sheep, who's sort of like the grand old dame of GMOs. The first thing I want to do is just for a little fun and enlightenment. Let's see, will this thing open up correctly? I think I got it. There it goes. So once this comes up, hoping it comes up correctly. This is just a little bit that Jimmy Kimmel did a while ago that I found immensely amusing. So let's see if he'll come up. There he is.
I switched from State
I knew we'd
Farm
get a
because of this
YouTube
site.
commercial.
They wanted me to pay $163 a month on my new
according to a new study,
Okay, so I'm going to move my hand.
people take us GMOs really know what they are. So we sent a crew to one of our local farmers markets to ask people why they avoid GMOs, and more specifically, what the letters GMO stand for. Enjoy.
Do you try to avoid GMOs in your diet?
I do. Yeah.
Tell me why.
There's just a vibration with GMOs. For me personally, just something that I don't particularly want to put into my body.
What does GMO stand for?
Genetically modified. Genetically modified.
The O?
The. I don't know.
Bishop Don Magic Wand, what is a GMO?
Well, I'm not really sure. You have to make me familiar with that. What is a GMO?
Do you try to avoid GMOs in your diet?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why is that?
Just the effects, I guess, on myself.
And what does GMO stand for?
Oh, man, putting me on the under the grill. Let's see. I don't even remember.
Do you try to avoid GMOs in your diet?
Absolutely.
Why?
Because they're not good for you.
What is a GMO?
It's genetically I don't know, what is it?
If you are eating whole foods, you want to eat what you're eating. You know what I mean? You want to eat what you see. And so, and you're avoiding processed food, but when the whole food is somehow contaminated, that's kind of making it a moot point.
What does GMO stand for?
genetically manufactured. Oh.
What is a GMO?
General modified ingredient, right?
What is a GMO?
It's something modified.
Do you try to avoid GMOs?
Sometimes, not a whole lot, but I try.
What is a GMO?
I don't know. I swear, I was just going along with it. I don't know what GMO is.
What is a GMO?
I don't know. I know it's like some corn bad stuff, right? I know it's bad, but to be completely honest with you, I have no idea.
What is a GMO?
I don't know, so I really don't care. It doesn't affect me. I'm not sick. I'm fine.
What is a GMO?
It's a genetically modified organism.
And what's GMO spelled backwards?
OMG. Nice.
Yeah, well, there you go. Now we have.
Okay. I always figure it's fun to put that up because most people have absolutely no idea what they're talking about with those. They've just been told it's bad, which is bad. So I'm going to go real quick over the just kind of the information we'll cover. I'm going to define GMOs, just what they are. Talk about how they're made and how that differs from conventionally bred organisms. Talk a bit about the regulation of GMOs and non-GMOs, safety testing of them, some specific questions or concerns that are commonly expressed, comparing GMOs to conventional foods, more examples of GMOs, the issue of labeling them, and then do they actually fulfill the promise they were put up for, which is feeding more people. Oh yeah, I'm going to mention what GMO stands for too. Quick note before we start, I'm not pro or anti-GMOs or much of anything to start with. I'm pro-science because that's what I do. And lastly, I'm pro-science, which means I believe nobody should try to jump off a building with the belief that they're going to fly. Science says no. All right, definition of GMOs and what it stands for. It stands for genetically modified organisms. And so that you know what that is, these are organisms in which the DNA has been altered in order to favor the expression of certain traits or the output of certain products such as proteins. There's a different definition, slightly different, more filled out, that the World Health Organization uses, and organisms in which DNA has been altered by modern biotechnology using methods that can allow selected genes to be transferred from one organism to another, either within the same species or between non-related species. So just an example of within, we can transfer genes from one mouse to another or one plant to another. And between non-related species, one of my favorites is transferring a gene from a firefly to a bacteria. And yes, if you do that right, you get glow-in-the-dark bacteria. So first I'm going to talk about genetic engineering, which is making genetically modified organisms, versus the conventional methods of making organisms. So this is a simple depiction of what goes on in making a GMO. You start out, let's say, with two organisms, one which has some trait that you want. Oh, yeah, and then one that does not have that trait. And that little green thing represents the gene that you want. So you take that gene off, you put it onto a circular piece of DNA called a plasmid, and its specific job is to put genes into various organisms at a defined site. So you put them together, now you've got the desired gene in the new organism, and you don't get any other genes transferred, and that gene goes right where you want it. This is conventional breeding. I've simplified it as much as I can. The little blue thing is the gene you want. Again, black doesn't have that desired mix. So then you get what's called recombination. This is how all of us were produced by our parents and so forth. And recombination, you just get kind of random mixes of the genes from the different parent organisms. So you can see when I show this, the first organism that comes out of there is sort of a mosaic of black and red and that one little blue gene you want. What you have to do is then take this, cross it back into the parent, the black one where you don't have all the genes you don't want. And then after you've done that several times, down at the bottom, you can see you've got the blue gene you want, but you still got red genes that you didn't want. And you can do these back crosses as long as you want. You're still going to have genes you don't want. And maybe more importantly, the gene you do want's in there, but you don't know where the heck it is. So moving on from there, I'm going to give you a analogistic comparison of them. So if you do, here you've got two organisms, the P1 and P2. If you do genetic engineering, you transfer one gene from the blue exactly where you want it in the red, in this case, deck of cards. This is what it's like. You've got a magician who knows exactly what his whole card deck looks like. He's got the one card that he wants to put in there, and as magicians will do, they'll put that card exactly where they want it. And you can see you end up with an organism that's all red except for that little blue card in this, or a blue gene that you want. Now we're going to go over to conventional breeding that you do. You've got some unwanted genes, some genes you do want, but you're not going to mix them precisely. This is more like shuffling cards. If you're not a magician and you shuffle cards, you have no idea what's going where. And you end up with this. Blue genes, red genes, all mixed in. You don't know which, you don't know where. There's no precision at all. So you can see genetic engineering methods, they're exquisitely precise. You will only get what you want. You will only get it where you want. Conventional breeding is anything but precise. Genes go all over the place at random. So we're going to look at the differences here. Precise genetic engineering versus random conventional breeding and how they are tested for safety. So with GMOs, there are multiple international organizations that work together and separately to establish GM food safety testing. This is just an idea of all the different international organizations that regulate GMOs around the world. And then nearly every country also has specific regulations of GMO testing and safety within that country. And I just put the UN flags up here so you get an idea that every country pretty much has it. So if they're testing for GMO safety, here's some things about how they're tested. You can test for specific genes. You've all heard of PCR. It seems to always make the news. And the little thing there on the left is what we call a tag. Its purpose is to find a specific sequence of DNA and then bind to it. And those little stars are like the fluorescents. This is one use where we actually use those firefly genes sometimes. So the gene you want to detect is that one in blue. If that tag or that probe binds to it, then you're going to get a signal. If it doesn't bind to it, you're going to get no signal, and you know that the gene you wanted did not transfer. You can also test the proteins instead of the genes. If you've ever heard of mass spectrometry, that's one way of doing it. You know the exact weight and other properties of the protein you want. And if you see that little spike in your mass spec run, you know you've got the right protein at the right size and roughly in the right amounts. If you want to see whether or not the gene that you've put is not only in there, but it's actually being read, there's things like quantitative PCR. And I won't go into the details, but basically the more of the gene that you have produced, the more that curve will go up like that. And lastly, you can test for mutations that might accumulate, which is very important for something as precise as a GMO. And just one way they do it is with what they call a gene chip. These gene chips now have a zillion and one uses, and you probably hear about them in the news. But the pattern of, in this case, green and red that you see spells out specific sequences of DNA and tells you if they have a mutation. So now we can get into the GM safety training itself, and compared to the conventional breeding as well. When you get to conventional breeding, the people who do that don't have very many regulations on them. So they're largely just self-regulated. Because they don't have any regulation or very little, they don't have to do safety testing for non-GMO or organic foods. So since these aren't tested or evaluated, you don't know if they're okay for your health. You don't know if they're okay for the environment. You're getting the impression it's a pretty loosey-goosey group. Now, here's something I found very interesting about conventionally bred foods. Mutation breeding is considered a conventional breeding method. This is kind of like irradiating the organisms in hopes of causing changes in specific genes, or rather changes in just about every gene. If you want to think about science, we use this to cause cancers. So here's the thing though, if you get an organism that was made by mutating varieties of organisms, you can sell it at the supermarket with the label organic. So if you're looking at foods that are sold as organic, that could be radiation-induced mutations, chemically induced mutations. They're kind of the real Franken foods. And that is Franken celery for those of you who don't know him. So now we're going to look at some other specific concerns people commonly tend to bring up with them. One is, can you transfer genetically modified genes? And this means outside of the laboratory, after the food has been produced. So looking at gene transfer, this is common in lower level genes like bacteria. And those newly acquired genes get translated into proteins. A really common thing you'll know about gene transfer in bacteria is this is largely how antibiotic resistant bacteria are made. And this has gone on so much in certain bacteria that they're resistant to dang near everything we can throw at them, which is disturbing. In higher organisms like sheep and animals, and also in plants, gene transfer is really, really rare. I mean, we're talking super rare. It's almost unheard of. The complex set of processes that it would have to go through, I'll show you just show you an example of a little later. And even if you get these newly acquired genes, they can only be translated into proteins, stuff you'd be likely to eat, if they get inserted in exactly the right place. So you can see why this isn't really a concern if you're putting some genetically modified corn into your body. So just a little PS that I think a lot of people don't realize. Every time you put food in your mouth, you're eating DNA. So I think a lot of people just don't appreciate that. They think it's all protein or something. So this is about gene transfer again, and it's looking at antibiotic resistant bacteria getting into your gut. And these are bacteria that you don't want because you might not be able to treat them if they make you sick. So basically, for a gene on some bacteria to get into you, it would have to run what I think of as a steeplechase, an impossibly intimidating one. First, you get DNA broken down whenever you start to process food. It starts breaking down as soon as you put it in your mouth. and it continues through the acid in the stomach, digestive proteins and such. So there's your first part of your steeplechase. The DNA gets further degraded, as I said, by digestive enzymes. Your system doesn't really want to put anything except the nutrients through your body. DNA doesn't count. So now you're into the next part of the steeplechase, stumbling into the canal. Then any DNA you do put in kind of tends to get taken up by your stomach bacteria, and they will degrade it by their own enzymes. Next part of the steeplechase. And if any DNA gets through all this and it's still got an intact gene, it has to match exactly some point in your own gene and insert there, and that place has to have what they call a promoter that will make the gene express itself. I saw somebody do a calculation on how likely it was for an intact gene to get through this steeplechase, and I can't remember the number, but it truly fit the word astronomical. So it doesn't happen. Again, this is just a quick look at organisms that are modified. I did this up at the slide above. And while you see there are a number of animals and bacteria that are modified, from here on, I'm going to primarily just be talking about genetically modified plants, so that I don't have to keep bouncing around talking about all sorts of different species, which complicates things more. And just as I'm talking about plants, just keep in mind that all sorts of organisms are genetically modified, and some of them, besides plants, are meant for food. And all organisms that get genetically modified are tested for proper production, safety, future mutations, all of that. They're tested pretty much just like plants are. So first question people have, we've made a genetic GMO. Can the genes that we put in there mutate? And the answer is yes, it can happen. There's no DNA in the world that can't mutate from time to time. However, every single year, the seeds that we use to plant for GMO crops, every year those seeds get retested, and they are looking for any mutations they can find in there. And this kind of testing includes their assessing of seeds that you use to plant in the first place. Then they will test the plants themselves. They will test the plant products, proteins, which are usually food proteins. And the genes are tested to make sure the sequence is right, but they also test the products or proteins and make sure those sequences are correct. So basically any stage of the life cycle of a plant has some sort of a testing that is done for genetically modified organisms. And again, keep in mind, non-GMOs go through none of this. So the next question everybody has is, maybe you're making these genetically modified proteins, but maybe they are sort of abnormal, lab produced, and they might hurt us. Again, every genetically modified protein or product has to be extensively tested to see if they're either toxic or if they can cause allergies in people. And so far, they have never found a case at all, anywhere, anytime, of a marketed GMO causing allergies, increased or new, nor have they caused any toxicity. I'll show you later the same cannot be said of conventional foods. So basically, there's zero evidence for genetically modified foods being unsafe. They're going to look briefly at some genetically modified proteins that are out there. One of the most common, and people aren't aware of this, but it's very common, is a bacterial toxin called the Bt toxin. What that bacterial toxin does is it's toxic to insects, and largely the organisms that do this are in the soil, so that they're right along with the plants. And if insects get that toxin in, basically the lining of their gut, the cells in there start to die. So it's literally like the lining of their gut starts to get stripped and dissolved. So this toxin can be engineered to be produced by the crop. So it doesn't just stay in the ground with those bacteria, but it actually gets into the plant itself, because insects don't spend much time on the ground. They usually land on the food producing part of the plant. So this helps the plant to be toxic to any insects, but the Bt toxin doesn't have any effect on higher mammals like us. So this also reduces the need to spray insecticides. And frankly, spraying insecticides onto the outside of a plant is more likely to be harmful. Little known fact that's fun to put in here is that the Bt bacteria itself, rather than the toxin, has been used for years and very widely by people who are organic farmers. They spray it on their crops. So they don't spray insecticide per se, they just spray entire bacteria. And if you spray stuff like this, it's going to go on the plants you want, but it's also going to go everywhere that is in the environment. So genetically modified keeps the toxin only in the plant. Spraying the bacteria, toxin gets everywhere, which can make insecticide resistant, which can, put the insecticide killing thing in stuff like weeds, nearby trees, where you may not want to kill insects. So just throwing a few examples of genetically modified plants that you'll see in the world. Some of them have herbicide tolerance. Herbicide would be something that kills other plants, like weeds. So alfalfa, soy, sugar beets, squash and zucchini, canola, all of those things have been made that are herbicide tolerant so that you can use less herbicide. Insect-resistant plants of various types include corn, rice, cotton, and a number of others. So there's all sorts of plants that get genetically modified, and not only are they different types of food, but they're very widely distributed around the world. So odds are you probably ate a GMO plant at some point. Something somebody asked me to put in at one point is, why do the companies who make GMOs keep such a strict control over them? Sometimes it seems excessive, but there's very good reason for it. One of the big reasons is that by keeping the company keeping control of the GMOs and how they get distributed, they can keep a better handle on maintaining the safety that they put so much effort into when they made it. Companies also have to do these things by law, because if there's any genetic drift or change of any kind, they had better find it or the government will come after them. Each year, these companies have to test all GMO products. So if they make corn and cotton, they've got to test them both. If they make differently modified types, they've got to test them all. And again, if any genetic drift is found or any notable change in the proteins they produced are found, the company can have to destroy an entire lot of GMOs. This could literally be silos full of nothing but seeds. It's very expensive. If the customers keep control of GMOs from year to year, then what will happen is those organisms might mutate and nobody will know. And that's why, farmers end up having to buy the GMO seeds year to year, because the companies simply can't have these things out in the wild doing whatever they want. And basically, I put it blows away any and all safety efforts, and you wind up with nicely controlled genetically modified organisms turning into Frankensteins. Here's a bit about GMO safety, and that's also pretty extensive. Are the GMO foods safe? I talked a little about this earlier. Simple answer, yes. Right now, most people don't realize there are over 300 million people around the world who've been eating GM crops for more than a decade. And that doesn't just include third world countries. That includes Western countries, Eastern countries, African countries. It's everywhere. And so far, there have been no health problems identified as being caused by the consumption of any GMO crop product. So I just put this in my sarcastic vein. There have been a few health problems caused by starvation and malnutrition, as opposed to eating GM crops. Then again, about safety, what about the conventionally bred foods? What do we see from them in terms of safety or lack thereof? They're not necessarily safe. And I probably shouldn't answer a flat no. It should have been no, there's no testing, there's no guarantee. So here are just some examples of conventionally bred foods that got into the supermarket before they found out that they were very unsafe. And looking down here, these you find the kiwi, which produces products that are highly allergic to a number of people. Tomatoes, there are tomatoes out there that produce toxins just because random genetic recombination will cause them to do that. Likewise, potatoes that have wound up on the shelves with toxins being produced in them at levels that can hurt people. And celery, here's the real Franken celery, produces some pretty severe skin irritants. And if I recall correctly, this whole crop of celeries that came out a couple of years, they had to go back, find where they all came from and destroy them all. This is a picture of what it looked like if you picked up one of that particular crossbred version of celery. That is how severe the rash could get. Okay, so here's the thing to remember. Conventional breeding is done by random recombination of all the genes, and the outcomes are not controllable. And I'll add in there that there's no required safety testing for these to see what kind of outcomes you could get. No testing. A little more about the conventionally bred foods. The kiwi is a wonderful example. This is a natural food that is produced down in the southern hemisphere, mostly in New Zealand. So they've had that kiwi fruit there for centuries. And at some point, somebody found it and said, this is yummy. And they decided to commercialize it in the United States in the 1960s. And around the same time also in Europe. Again, no pre-market safety testing. After all, it just grows on trees, it must be fine. You get some humans who develop allergic reactions. And after decades after the commercial release, the protein was isolated and characterized. Oops, sorry. But you've still got kiwis all over, and I'm not really sure that they've done much by way of safety testing. I do know that I have seen one person have an allergic reaction to the kiwi, and we were minutes from taking him to the ER, but he had gulped down a tremendous amount of Benadryl from the local Walgreens and finally started calming down. That's how severe that reaction can be. So, not safe. So here's another thing people bring up about GMOs. Can't we label the things? We see non-GMO stuff labeled, like that's wonderful. How about if we label genetically engineered foods? So what I see here is, are we going to label the more dangerous non-GMO foods according to their risk? A lot of people will see those non-GMO labels and they think, oh, that's the good stuff. Not necessarily, as I've been showing you. They probably should put a label that says non-GMO with allergens or something like that, or may cause severe intestinal upset. So if we are going to label GMOs, we need to label non-GMOs, and we also need to educate people at least enough to know what GMO stands for. Excuse me. So again, if you don't label things correctly and label everything thoroughly, people are going to start concluding that labeling is needed because the GMOs are dangerous. On the other hand, if you label GMOs and then label the risks of non-GMOs, hopefully it kind of balances out. So this is just a bit of logic that has actually gone through courts and legislation, where people say, well, if GMOs are not dangerous, then you shouldn't be afraid to label them. So somebody says, okay, we'll label them. And they have. And then the return result is, oh my God, GMOs are being labeled. The companies and the government must finally be admitting that they're dangerous. Whereupon all you can do is facepalm. So again, about labeling GMOs, there's a Fairness in Labeling Act that's been put out by all of these federal agencies. And GMO foods can be labeled as USD approved for safe for human consumption. If you happen to find a GMO organism on your shelf at the supermarket, look around and see if it says something like this somewhere on the label. And then look at a non-GMO plant and see if that, or a non-GMO product, and see if that labels all the risks. So non-GMO labeling, they'll label it as safe for human consumption, but there's no testing to assure their safety, whereas the GMO foods are, and they're frequently labeled as such. And I put a little label down here from a non-GMO product in the supermarket, and you can see that it has all sorts of stuff in there, probably stuff we're used to seeing in labels, but there's no label about risk anywhere on this thing. And if you wonder what that is, that's spam. And of course, I think we all thought that wasn't safe to eat. I didn't put it on here, but if you ever wonder what's in spam, that's really an acronym for skunk, possum, armadillo, and mouse. So finally, we're going to look at, do GMOs do what they're really intended for? Are they feeding more people on the planet and reducing the use of herbicides and insecticides that can be toxic to the environment, particularly? So herbicide and pesticide use. Genetically modified herbicide tolerant canola has been adopted in a number of places, and the research that they've done later has shown that the decrease in the volume of herbicides applied is quite significant. The blue bar there shows that they decreased the amount used by almost 17%. And the impact on the environment was considered, and that was reduced by a bit over 25%. They did a similar study on genetically modified insect-resistant cotton, and the insecticide use went down by 25%, and the environmental impact was reduced by a little bit more than 25%. This is a slide I put in here because I want to show that every report that's made doesn't show or doesn't use the exact same information, and they can come to very different conclusions. And I'll let you know, the scientific community looks at both sides, and we love nothing more than to get into the arena and slug it out with each other. So the International Union of Conservation of Nature did some research into herbicide-resistant crop, find that they occupy about 70% of the land. I'm sorry, herbicide-resistant crops are nearly 70% of the GM crops that are planted. And this has been accompanied, they found in many cases, by increased use of herbicides. Glyphosate, so you know, is that's Roundup. That's the active product in Roundup. Herbicide use in the United States in areas dominated by GM crops have also had some increase in use, and they found a number of herbicide-tolerant weeds nearby the herbicide-tolerant plants. So now that we've got this kind of tolerance spreading around, you are having an environmental impact that's significant. And they're also having to spend more money because now they're having to use different herbicides in order to deal with the tolerant weeds and such. So this again is the ICUN findings that some regions where the GM crops have been widely grown, farmers have tended to rely on too much on the use of single herbicides like Roundup. And they've then, by using too much of it, they've actually caused more resistance in other plants. And the point of the thing being, the whole point of making these crops is so you can use less of the herbicide, but the farmers get it into their heads that, oh, the crop is herbicide resistant. That means we can throw shitloads of stuff on there. That's not how it works. So it winds up having negative effects. And I do want to mention the ICUN. They are a legitimate organization that does legitimate science. They do not exist to, try to declare GM products to be unsafe. They just do research, but they tend very often to look at different kinds of data than some of the other researchers. And it's basically, the IUCN can be described as kind of like the people who would like to jump into the ring if you don't have a good enough opponent already. So they lean a little bit against GMOs, but not much. They just push hard for careful consideration and regulation of anything that affects planetary ecosystems. So you can find the ICUN doing geological research. They can be doing plant-based research. They will research ecological niches for insects and plants. They're very widespread, but they're not really against anybody to start with. Just an idea how widespread these things, or rather how much of an effect GMO crops have had around the world. They've increased crop yields around the world, an average of 21%. Herbicide-tolerant soybeans improved crop yield by about 30% in Romania specifically. Herbicide-tolerant corn has delivered improvements of 9% in Argentina. In the Philippines, where we use 15%. So, and this is just a little more about some of the increased production they've caused in poor areas of the world. From 96 to 07, which is about the first decade where GMO crops started to get used a lot, and they were growing in the amount that they were being used. You got crop production in soybeans, you got about almost 68 million tons of additional production of those as these things came more into use. corn, cotton, canola, you can see that every one of them wound up with millions of tons more production. In 2007 alone, by this time GMO crops were widespread, you can see that each year for most of these, the increase was quite a lot greater than you'd get for an average of the 10 years before. And change in production. Yeah, okay, this is just general change in production rather than the additional millions of tons production. So the percent change in production of plants, you can see in all those different types, was substantial. And I want to give an example of one GMO crop that is probably one of the most impactful that's been produced. And this is golden rice. Golden rice produces a precursor for vitamin A. This is important because vitamin A deficiency kills about 670,000 children each year who are under the age of 5, and it causes another 500,000 cases of an irreversible type of blindness. So you've got over 1 million children either dead or blind. Golden rice is grown and consumed in a lot of places with these shortages, and its purpose is to synthesize the precursor to vitamin A. So when you eat it, your body metabolizes this beta carotene into vitamin A. So this increases the nutrient value, and golden rice is slowly being put into various places, and it is winding up producing better nutrition because they're getting more food, and it has reduced the occurrence of this irreversible blindness. Just a quick look, because that was mostly about crops, at some of the GM animals you'll find. The GMO fish can be used in scientific research. They've also genetically engineered some of them to be used as pets. Most of those are engineered to live longer, so your pet doesn't die as soon. They've also been engineered to work as environmental pollutant sentinels. This you can liken to the mine canaries. These fish will detect pollutants in the environment more quickly than we can test them by having people go out and test each bit of water. So this helps with aquacultural food production, since we can keep the pollutants monitored. Then there are some fish that are actually engineered to grow more. A good example of that is the AquaVantage salmon, which has been in use for about 3 years. And they're actually the first animal that's approved for, first GM animal approved for human consumption. And the major purpose is just to make the fish grow bigger, faster, so you can get it out of the water and onto the market sooner. Okay, so that is what I had to say. I know it's a lot of information in kind of a hurry, so I certainly encourage everyone to ask questions, because I'm sure I didn't cover everything you want to know about. So I'm going to try. Yeah, there we go. We should all be back now. So now, if you can remember some of all you saw, please ask questions. You can kind of wave your hand. Okay, it looks like Robert, you have a question? I think you're on mute still, Robert.
So what I see is, so I would have to agree that GMOs have the capacity to feed more people and that they're not poisonous. However, the agricultural policies that come with GMOs and the regulatory capture from the corporations that promote them, like Monsanto, really, you really have to ask, I have to ask myself the question, is the scientific boosterism behind them good public policy. For instance, the golden rice. So the USDA says, hey, golden rice doesn't work in 2016 and that we don't want it in the US. And please check my reference and check my assertion. So so one of the questions that comes up in the critiques is, would we need golden rice if we didn't have monocultures that were promoted by IMF? Okay, so IMF promotes
IMF. I'm not familiar with that.
The International Monetary Fund.
Okay.
So economic policy causes countries to do things like monocultures that where really agricultural diversity and vitamin A deficiency didn't exist so much in the past. The monoculture of rice causes that nutritional deficiency to exist. Now, there's no doubt in my mind, and no doubt from what I've seen in the literature, that genetically modified foods can feed a lot more people. However, I'd like to say that in absence of better public policy, you end up with things like factory stores where Monsanto sells you the GMOs, sells you the glyphosate, and then their partner Cargill buys it up, and essentially the family farm becomes a sharecropper. So they have a monopsony economically that is just an entire circular system of grabbing profit and contributes to a race to the bottom. So I would like to suggest that these technologies, as wonderful as they are, in absence of better public policies, they're a mixed blessing. They certainly are a blessing in a lot of cases, but they're pretty mixed. And so to me, social and economic policy, when it doesn't inform scientific and corporate policy, you get a mixed result. I'm done.
Sorry, my rooster interrupted you a little there. Okay, so in mentioning the public policies, can you give me an example of some of the ones you're referring to?
So I think that the golden rice is a good example of it. And after the presentation, consider looking up golden rice controversy. And you'll see that USDA doesn't think it's so hot. Then look up the feminist Indian agriculturalist Vandana Shiva and Arundhati Roy, Vandana has a PhD in physics, but does agriculture now. So those would be some references to look up the critics of this. All of that being said, I think my opinion is that there's a real good case for GMOs, but they need a whole lot more regulation in the public policy arena.
Yeah, I know. And I have looked up some of the stuff for the problems or objections to golden rice. I'm aware of some of that. One of the big objections that I've seen is actually the economics of it. It's primarily put in third world countries. That's where you want it. They don't have a lot of money to pay for that. So yeah, that one's a little bit troublesome. It's also why the International Monetary Fund gets involved. And I agree, there's some difficulty, shall we say, with public policy. And I have not heard of anything that's a really good solution to that. But I'm also not directly involved in regulation and economics. So I can't address that specifically with good qualifications. But thanks for bringing it up. And it is a good debate to be aware of.
Bob,
Somebody else?
Can I
Yeah.
can I add to that? One of the things that I've been having a lot of controversy in my own mind about is I wish I had it in front of me, but let me see if I can express it. Um, the human population is going to peak at the end of this century at about 11 billion and then start declining. In order to feed that population, if I may make this very simple, you have about 50% of small farms, and the rest of the farming in the world is large industrial firms. You have a huge number of issues that are climate associated with farming. Too much fertilizer used, too much water used, and a number of other issues, pesticides, herbicides, et cetera, in which you have to cut down. You have eutrophication, now obviously down in New Orleans area and any other river that's dumping it into the ocean, as well as problems with the ocean environment. Not all created by farming, but a huge, maybe 30% created by farming. So part of human survival and climate change problems have to be solved worldwide from a farming standpoint. And some of the components of which Bob has already mentioned. But what's bothering me is that if you want these changes globally, it's going to be extremely difficult to make those changes from a small family farm setting. Whereas it's already been shown in India that if you change to large industrial farms, you can feed a hell of a lot more people. So the controversy between what the conservationists say have to be small family, you grow it at home kind of thing, versus the controversy of trying to feed 11 billion people and doing that, in my mind, has become a major problem that I can't seem to answer. And I don't know if anybody has any clear-cut science to help me with this.
Yeah, and that's, as you just mentioned or exemplified already, that's a multifactorial problem. I have a friend who loves looking into the fertilizer issue, and the current fertilizers that we use and the methods of producing them are pretty rapidly coming to, I guess you'd call it a wall, where it's going to be hard to keep up and get past it as you start to farm more and more. So that leaves us wanting better ways to produce fertilizer or plants that can grow with less. I'm not sure which way is going to produce a better solution. The use of land is going to be a problem. We all know that the longer you use the same piece of land, the more you deplete nutrients. Can that be genetically modified? I don't know. It's going to take a lot of work. Then I've actually seen the big farm versus small farm thing being put up. The big farms, like you said, are going to be necessary to feed a growing population. They are finding that if people do small farms, and we're talking like, 1 or 2 yard garden size, they can feed themselves on an awful lot of stuff. Corn, tomatoes, there's a couple of good examples. So there's probably going to be some sort of balance there. Oh, and global warming, which will change the temperatures and the topology, which will, change the amount of water available in different places, modify the growing seasons. That's another one that's got to be factored into this. So I mean, that's so multifactorial. I'm already pretty well lost, and it's going to take a lot of people doing a lot of thinking. to find all the solutions for that. I suspect GMOs will be part of it, though. Thanks. Somebody else have one?
Yeah, Mike, you were talking about in the presentation, you had shown that herbicides or that plants got GMO plants that were made resistant to this glyphosate Roundup, basically. And then the weeds started to become intolerant to the glyphosate as well. Are there any, and you talked about several organizations that kind of regulate GMOs or, check them out and everything. It seems to me like implementing GMOs on the scale that we're doing it requires an organization to kind of look at that overall thing. Like, how did the weeds becoming intolerant just by dumping glyphosate on there ever get to be an issue? I guess if there had been somebody kind of looking at more of a big picture there, and yeah, maybe it is a multifactorial thing, but that the manufacturers or the companies that do the GMOs and the companies that sell Roundup could have foreseen that situation coming up and could have coached the farmers, educated them to perhaps have avoided that kind of a situation. Are any of those groups you talked about, that ICU, and also when you're talking about these organizations or these GMOs are tested for safety, is that done by the FDA or is that the USDA group that does that?
Would you mind if I answer some of that? I'm a academic physician, and I'd like to analogize that problem with antibiotic-resistant bacteria. I will tell
Give me
you.
just a minute before you go on with this. Before I lose track, I'd like to deal with what Conrad said, and then you can throw in afterwards. So, Conrad, as far as the farmers using stuff excessively, that is part of what the companies try to educate the farmers on. What happens is, as will happen with darn near everything that you give to a human, they'll take it home, start using it, and then start doing things you told them to never do.
Okay.
I don't know if I don't know if Peter was going to mention it, but antibiotic resistance gets encouraged by, us people taking home a prescription of antibiotics, and then we take it for 3 days, feel better, and save the last portion of it or toss it. That you're not doing what you're told to do, and it causes problems. So that's exactly what's going on with the farmers. Just, hey, it's herbicide resistant. Let's throw crap loads of herbicides on there. And I can assure you, as soon as they find out about it, the GMO companies are going.
Yeah. Okay.
And then the other thing you were asking about, who does the testing? The testing itself is actually done by the companies who produce it, because they have all the protocols, the machinery, the trained scientists to do it. But the results all have to be reported back to the FDA, the USDA, whatever, the WHO organizations, whoever is controlling those regulations. So the company does it because they have the best ability to test it. All those results then have to go to regulators so they can say, okay, you did the right test, you got the results we want, and you took the right steps, which could be, like I said, destroying silos full of seed.
Sure. Are you aware of competitive GMO companies cross-testing each other's work? Do they check on competition A and make sure that their stuff is safe? Because it's kind of like a hen or a wolf in the hen house kind of a thing.
Yes, it is. It's mainly why the regulators are there. They have to give a pass. They have to give a passing grade, and they also come through the company labs themselves. I know when I've worked in labs, not on GMOs, but we would have somebody like OSHA or the FDA. They would just come walking through our labs, taking notes, asking questions, asking to see raw printouts of data and tell us exactly what we did to get that. So I see exactly what your objection is, but the regulatory agencies, frankly, they're pretty picky, especially because if you do something wrong, they can fine you. And the USDA probably doesn't object to, Monsanto paying them $500 million for a fine. So again, there's a lot of things set up to check them. Competing companies do not do the testing. I'm sure that sometimes they do. Just, what the heck, we've got some time. Let's test Cargill's GMO seeds. But I don't think they're doing that. They're not doing it for regulatory purposes, but I guarantee you that if they found something wrong with the seeds, they would jump up, scream, and whistle real loudly to the USDA. Hope that answers you.
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
Peter, I don't know if you had anything more you wanted to add. If we got interrupted there.
The analogy is antibiotic resistance. If you can imagine, just imagine the possible solution here, where you have the American government coming out and telling physicians and patients that the physicians can't tell them or can't give them antibiotics for X. You would have a huge uproar. And this is just based on watching vaccine response or unresponse. The problem is that patients demand something from their physician for a cold, and what they get is antibiotics that modify bacteria in their gut, which then mutate to spread that resistance. The background of all of this, whether it be herbicides in the field or bacteria in your gut, is evolution continues, and the modifications that occur with those most rapidly replicating organisms. So you get changes that occur in rapidly replicating organisms, and based on just the antibiotic resistance, it's very, very clear that companies have said, I'm not going to produce anymore because it's not worth my while. I can't get the antibiotic to survive long enough, to be out there long enough before something mutates and it's resistant. So I'm not going to produce anymore unless I'm supplemented. But that's not the solution. The solution is trying to educate people not to do X, Y, and Z, which is extremely difficult, whether it be farmers or patients, especially, I might add, when you sit in front of TV ads, and I must say it must be 70 to 90% of them are plugging whatever product whatever drug they want to plug, which to me shouldn't be done, but
Right.
I say just right at the end there where you're hitting commercials for drugs. Last time I checked, the United States and South Africa were the only countries on planet Earth that allow drug advertisement. I think that there should be zero, because there's no reason for me or you or anybody else on here who may or may not know much about any particular drug, something to treat my arthritis or something. There's no reason for us to walk into the doctor and say, do you think omestomab might be good for me? And the doctor looks at you and goes, I don't know. Are you having trouble with endometriosis, sir? You look like a real idiot. So I think they should just kill those commercials and let the doctors who know what they're doing recommend drugs. Yeah, and as for
I'd
teaching
agree.
people what to do, somebody else I think mentioned, I think it was Conrad who was asking about, can you teach people to use herbicides correctly? It's like you can tell them how to use them correctly, but actually getting them to go home and do that, as you've said, Peter, that can be very difficult.
Mike,
Yes.
I have a question, Mike.
Uh-huh.
Is there enough competition out there to where if a farmer decides they don't want to use a certain company's seeds anymore, they have other choices, and so it's not all this power in one company's hands?
There is there's definitely competition out there. One of the things that does make it a little difficult, though, is as soon as a company's got an idea for, we're going to attack this particular gene, they just love to get patent protection. And patent protection, depending on, the particular organism, the particular gene, the particular products and regulations, that can run, I think 17 years is the standard number, but it can be extended beyond that sometimes. So that's a long time for, let us say, Cargill to have pretty near a monopoly on a particular seed. And if another company wants to compete with them, they have to do something that's sufficiently different that they won't get smacked down in a patent suit. So yes, the competition's there, but it is one of those areas where the regulation is pretty darn tricky. Once we get out about 20 years, then there'll be more competition because a lot of those patents will run off. And I think I might have seen somebody else with a hand up, but.
Robert, did you have your hand up?
Oh, there he is.
So yeah, one of the things that I see in your presentation, Mike, and from other participants, is these dumb farmers are dumping too much glyphosate on. That's the subtext that I got. Whether you intended it that way, perhaps not. I'm sure that some people do intend it that way. Again, from my vanishingly slim knowledge of agricultural policy, the farmers are pretty savvy, and they get pushed into dumping lots of phosphates on through agricultural policy and through pricing. So they kind of know what they're doing, and that might go to Peter's point that that people dump a bunch of antibiotics on. But I don't think it's so cut and dry that the farmers are just being contrary or dumb.
Yeah.
So that's my point. There's any of the technologies that we have today are bafflingly complex, and there's tons of policy components to them. And yeah, we kind of have to trust experts, but they're hard to trust because of regulatory capture of where the corporations capture the regulators and revolving door policies. I certainly don't have an answer, and I don't mean to criticize, but it's a complex world out there, and yeah, we don't have the answers. So
yep.
Thanks.
You're right. Yeah, and I don't, like you say, I don't think it's always a case of stupid farmers. I do know from being in the pharma business for many years that all pharma businesses have professionals whose whole purpose in life is to try to educate customers on whatever it is they're using, whether it be, an arthritis treatment or herbicides on GM plants. And every single one of them will express a frustration with people not doing what they told them to do. But it's not everybody. I imagine most of us and most people we know get an antibiotic regimen and take the whole thing. It doesn't take too many people to screw it up. And the other one I was very surprised to find out many years ago is that some of the large farms will go out and use too much herbicide or something like that. I was really surprised with them because I would have thought that they would be subject to regulations that would stop them from doing that. But that's an area of regulatory law that I have to admit straight up, I know probably, about one bacteria's worth. I mean, I just don't know that well at all. And you're also right. You said again, it's a multifactorial issue, just like what Peter was asking about. And no one of us has got all the solutions to that.
Let me step in real quick. I'd like to end the recording. So Tom, just go ahead and end the recording, but the conversation can continue. And Peter, I think you had your hand